Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar on strategic energy transition towards carbon neutrality under the impact of COVID-19, lessons from Japan. I'm Siti Indati Mustafa from the Institute of Energy Policy and Research, or IPRI, University Tenaga Nasional. In today's webinar, we are delighted to have Prof. Dr. Ken Koyama virtually on board with us to discuss the actionable pathways of the Japanese government to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and carbon neutrality by 2050 under the COVID-19 crisis. This morning's discussion aims to contribute to the continuing policy deliberation on implementation's priority and pathways to decarbonize the economy in the following decades towards carbon neutrality. Let me introduce Prof. Dr. Ken Koyama. He is currently the Chair in Energy Economics of Energy Commission at University Tenaga Nasional, who also the Chief Economist and Managing Director of the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, or IEEJ. Professor Dr. Ken Koyama is mandated to provide the leadership and strategic direction to strengthen the Institute of Energy Policy and Research capacity to achieve research excellence at UNI10. I am pleased to thank all of you for joining this webinar. I think the Secretariat Organizer has informed me that today's registered participants are about 140, mainly from energy-related agencies, regulators, academics, and researchers. Again, allow me to sincerely record our appreciation for your presence today in discussing the topic of strategic energy transition towards carbon neutrality under the impact of COVID-19, lessons from Japan. And I hope that we have a fruitful webinar. Before we move on to Prof. Ken's presentation, I would like to draw your attention to the flow of today's webinar. Right after Prof. Ken's presentation, after this, we will have a moderated discussion of about 30 minutes, and we will then address the questions from participants at the end of the moderated discussion. To all participants, you can post your question anytime in the Q&A control panel. I think without further ado, I think we'd like to welcome Prof. Ken Koyama for your presentation for the topic of strategic energy transition towards carbon neutrality under the impact of COVID-19, lessons from Japan. Over to you, Prof. Ken.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, Prof. We can hear you clearly.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Siti, thank you very much indeed for your very kind and nice introduction. And good morning to you all. It is a great pleasure to be back with you to discuss a very important energy themes or energy topic in the world, which has clearly a great implication to Malaysian energy stakeholders. Once again, thank you very much for joining today's webinar. I am very happy to be with you and to share my views and experience in Japan, in which Japan is trying to our best effort to address a very serious energy and climate challenge toward carbon neutrality up to 2050. So I will start to share my slide. So one moment, please. Can you see my slide?
Yes, it's clear, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. The overall theme of my talk is Japan's strategic energy transition, based on the latest discussion on Japan's strategic energy plan. We call it SEP, SEP, I'll come back on later, but it's a very, very important and the most fundamental basic energy policy document for Japan with a long-term, this time for up to 2050 energy outlook or projection or scenario to address Japan's energy challenges. In particular, I put it here that the voyage to uncharted water. So in a sense, there are so many uncertainties or unpredictabilities before us if we really try to head for the carbon neutrality. It's a very, very ambitious target. In particular, at this moment, we all suffer from the COVID-19 crisis. The situation in Japan is still very serious, just as the case of your country in Malaysia. But every country in the world are still struggling with the serious safety and health and social issues created by COVID-19 pandemic. So under the circumstance, we need to have the strategic energy transition toward 2050 and probably much longer time. Firstly, I would like to draw your attention that the global energy landscape surrounding us in Japan or in Malaysia are very much complicated and very much uncertain. As I mentioned, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is really unprecedented. It started earlier last year, and many people hope that this pandemic could be stabilized within the year 2020 or early this year 2021, thanks to the effect of vaccine or widespread use of vaccine. Of course, it happens in some cases, but still we are seeing the large number of newly infected persons, citizens, by this pandemic. So under the circumstance, global energy market became very uncertain and very volatile and very unpredictable. And furthermore, since last year in particular, we are seeing the global waves of carbon neutrality target to be announced by major economies, including Japan, but EU, China, United States, and others. And of course, under these circumstances, we have to be careful and to watch what is the implication of the change in the US administration. Now, Mr. Biden is leading the United States as the president, and the Biden administration, the policy inside the United States and towards the world are greatly changed from the previous Trump administration. This is true in case of energy policy and in particular climate policy. The Trump administration didn't pay much attention at all to the climate policy, but in contrast to the previous administration, Mr. Biden himself became very, very keen to address carbon neutrality in the United States and also to promote this concept outside the United States. He asked the cooperation with Japan, EU, China, and other countries in the world so that the world should be encouraged to make a best effort to promote a carbon neutrality status. But at the same time, since the Biden administration inaugurated, the situation surrounding the US-China relation became increasingly difficult. Now, some of the people are calling this situation as a US-China new Cold War. It's a really very difficult geopolitical circumstances. So under this situation, the global energy geopolitics are on the agenda again. And to address the carbon neutrality and the increasing difficult geopolitics, the advanced technology or innovative technology need to play a bigger role to enhance energy security and climate change protection. Under these global circumstances, Japan continue to make the very serious effort to revise Strategic Energy Plan, SEP. As I mentioned, SEP is the most basic document for long-term energy policy of Japan. The basic of this SEP started in the year 2002, when the Basic Energy Policy Act was enacted. And based on this act law, the first SEP was authorized by Cabinet in the year 2003. And since then, every 3 years or 4 years, SEP is stipulated to be revised. And the latest and current existing SEP was Cabinet approved in the year 2018. And this fifth version of SEP called for the achievement of 2030 energy mix target, which I will come back on later. But now, as we are now in the year 2021, 3 years later, this SEP fifth version, the METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, created a special advisory council to discuss the revision of SEP. And this discussion continued almost 2 years. And now I do believe that this is really a final stage. The final draft was made and now uploaded in METI website. Unfortunately, it is still written in Japanese. And now that the public comment and the public opinion is called for, and later on, I believe this final draft can be positioned as the official draft, and this draft is submitted to the METI ministers, and once METI minister received the document, this document goes up to the cabinet level, and the cabinet approval will be expected sometime, probably October, so that this document can be the official basis for the preparation of COP26 for Japanese government. And importantly, one of the characteristic or most important characteristics of this sixth version of SEP incorporate the 2050 carbon neutral target. You may know that last October, Prime Minister Suga himself declared that Japan's carbon neutral aspiration in the year 2050. And this ambitious target set the baseline for the discussion of SEP. And when the Biden administration came into power January this year, Mr. Biden called for the international cooperation to be strengthened in terms of the climate change protection measures, and he invited the many leaders in the world to be gathered at the Climate Leader Summit in April this year. At the time of this summit meeting, the Prime Minister of Japan again made a strategic declaration that Japan's 2030 GHG reduction target should be enhanced to reach to 46%. And this enhancement of GHG reduction target again can become a very important pillar or important condition to discuss the SEP. But at the same time, of course, carbon neutrality, GHG reduction enhancement can be a key. But Japan, the energy policy, 3E plus S. 3E stands for energy security, environmental protection, economic efficiency, 3Es, and the safety concept is required. So to meet 3E and the safety all together simultaneously, the strategic emphasis is put on the innovative technology, in particular the longer-term energy policy. But coming back to the issues of volatility or unpredictability or uncertainty under the impact of COVID-19 crisis or pandemic, we are seeing the very volatile international energy market situation. For example, this is typically seen in the movement of the price of energy. Last year in April, for the first time in its history, we saw that the WTI futures contract recorded the minus prices, $37 in April. But after that, it bounced back and gradually went up. And since this June or July, it reached as high as $70 per barrel. The $70 WTI was never seen since the 1918. So it is extreme volatility recorded in the oil prices or another energy market. This was created that a very, very big change in demand and supply and the impact of COVID-19 crisis. And this was also seen in other markets, but very interestingly and very importantly, we are seeing the extreme volatility in the LNG or gas prices, in particular in Asia, which has an implication for all the Asian energy market stakeholders, including yourself, Malaysia. And there's a very severe negative impact on economy and society created by COVID-19. The LNG spot prices in Asia, which reflect the demand-supply fundamentals, shown in the orange line, hit the bottom of $2 per million BTU, the lowest historical record of the LNG spot price for Asia. But surprisingly, it returned back to very sharply rise, and early this year, when the cold snap hit Japan and China and Korea, in the very short term, that the LNG spot price hit the record high $32 per million BTU, which equals to almost $200 per barrel in crude oil equivalent, the extreme high prices. But after things can be normalized, cold snap went away, but again, the LNG spot prices, orange line, began to rise very sharply and currently hovering at around $16 per million BTU, which is equal to the previous higher price level period of 2011-2014. So the market became extremely volatile since the effect of the COVID-19 crisis hit the world. But apart from the impact of COVID-19, as I mentioned earlier, the carbon neutrality became a very, very important issue for the world. EU as a fast runner, followed by China, Japan, and the United States, and all the major countries are now heading for carbon neutrality. But as I mentioned earlier, carbon neutrality achievement is not at all an easy task. It is extremely challenging. Promotion of energy efficiency improvement or energy saving, and non-fossil energy promotion like renewable nuclear power is a very important prescription to meet the carbon neutrality target. And also that electrification with zero emission power is essential. But at the same time, innovative technologies such as hydrogen or direct air capture, bioenergy, and CCS is needed if we really want to reach the carbon neutrality. And under the circumstance, IEA published a very, very interesting report this May. We call it a net zero emission report. Some of you had an experience to read or to check and to make difference to this very important report. The IEA's NZT net zero emission report has the assumption or some kind of concept that in the world, in the year 2050, all the world entire world can be carbon neutral or net zero emission, GHG net emission zero. And if this status can be materialized, how the world should change from the current status? This is a basic concept of IEA's net zero emission report. So it's not a projection. It's not a kind of outlook. On the contrary, it's a kind of backcasting approach. In other words, first, IEA put the 2050 world figure as the entire world should be carbon neutral. And to meet this goal, how the world should change from the current status. It's not a projection at all. So please be careful when you read the report. This is a very important guidance to read the IEA's report. But at the same time, you can see from this picture that currently the world depends almost 80% of fossil fuel supply, oil, gas, and coal. But in the year 2050, if the world should reach the net zero emission, the contribution from fossil fuel will be less than 20%. Renewable and other forms of non-fossil energy will account the dominant part of the global energy supply. It's a kind of very radical or revolutionary change from the current status. Under these global circumstances, Japan continued to have serious discussion to revise the SEP. But the fourth and fifth SEP, we have a very important 3E+S policy target. Firstly, safety as a top priority precondition. Why? This is because the SEP number 4, number 5 was made after the Fukushima nuclear crisis. The safety is given a number 1 priority. And energy security, one of the key elements is to increase the energy self-sufficiency of Japan. Japan is known to have a very poor in domestic energy resources like oil, gas, coal. So when we depend on fossil fuel, naturally we became very much import dependent. So currently we are almost 6, 7, 8% of energy sufficiency. But in this SEP, we aim to increase that energy self-sufficiency up to 25%. In the economic efficiency goals, the main target is to reduce electricity cost of Japan from the current level up to the year 2030. The environmental goal to set GHG emission reduction goal comparable to those of the US and the EU. And actually, the number of the reduction target is 26% reduction from the level in 2013. And to meet these 3E+S conditions, the result of the energy mix target is indicated here. We need to enhance the energy efficiency, and after the energy efficiency target is met, the power mix in the year 2030 should be comprised of renewable 20 to 24%, nuclear 20 to 22%, LNG 27%, and coal 26%. And within this renewable, the hydropower is a major component, but hydropower is a very stable, and there will be no increase from now on to the year 2030 because of the limited availability. But the increase mostly comes from solar and some part of wind and biomass and geothermal, but solar power is expected to become the major part of the incremental of renewable energy in Japan. But as I mentioned, now the Prime Minister gave us the very important condition of 46% GHG reduction target instead of the current 26% reduction. For only 9 years left to reach to 2030, we need to increase the emission reduction by the factor of 20% point. That's why we should further encourage the ambitious energy efficiency, energy saving target. The current target is about 40 million tons of oil equivalent of energy saving, but to meet this 46% GHG reduction target, we further enhance the energy saving to 53 million tons oil equivalent. And for power generation, nuclear target remains same at 20 to 22%. Before this 46% GHG reduction target is given, many advisory council members discussed that we may need to revise down the nuclear target, given the difficulty to achieve the restart of the nuclear power. But to meet 46% reduction, we need to have a very serious contribution from nuclear. That's why we decided to maintain this 20 to 22% target. And RE target should really be increased to meet this enhanced GHG reduction to 36 to 38% from the current 20 to 24%. And the secret to this is 2/3 of RE increase from this is expected from, again, solar PV. The reason why is very simple. If we have only 9 years left up to 2030, other renewable option cannot play a bigger role. In the longer term, we in Japan expect that the wind power, in particular offshore wind power, will play a bigger role. But because of the lead time needed to other energy or renewable option, only possibility to contribute greatly to enhance that the power generation from renewable can be from solar PV. But at what cost is a very, very serious challenge. And for the first time ever in Japan's energy policy history, hydrogen and ammonia give a numerical number of 1% to be in power generation. 1% very small, yes, I agree, but for the first time ever in our history to given this 1% share, which should be increased up to the 2050 target. I'll come back later. And under the circumstance, the target of natural gas and coal should be reduced. And within this, with this energy mix target, energy security or energy self-sufficiency target should be updated up to 30% from the current 24%. But again, it is very important to note, electricity cost increase should be inevitable because of the new target of energy mix. But the key point is cost up should be minimized. But more important is a carbon neutrality pathway in the year 2050. In our 2030 energy mix, still we have a substantial CO2 emission of 0.9 billion tons, which has two parts. One is the non-power sector, household, industry, and transport in combination. We have almost 0.6 billion tons of CO2 emission in the 2030 energy mix. And power sector, we have seen that the significant reduction from the current level, but still we have 0.36 billion ton CO2 emission in the year 2030. But if we really want to achieve the zero emission or carbon neutrality in the year 2050, firstly, all this emission should be zero by using the zero emission power, which the government give as a kind of reference. RE should account to 50 to 60%, nuclear power plus CCUS fossil fuel power generation should account 30 to 40%, and hydrogen ammonia should account to 10%. So all the power is zero emission power. But please note, this volume is larger than this current level. Why? The increased volume of power generation can be used to reduce emission from the non-power sector. Non-power sector emission should be reduced partly by electrification, partly using the hydrogen, methanation, or biomethane and other form. But as you can see from this black part, it is not possible to remove the fossil fuel use entirely. So some part of fossil fuel use will remain. This will create a CO2 emission, and this emission will be net zero by the use of forest sink and direct air capture and BECCS. This is a concept of net zero emission. The key point is we made a scenario analysis by reference case as a kind of baseline, which comprises of about 50% of renewable power generation, nuclear 10%, ammonia 30%, CCUS 30%, and other than this reference, renewable 100%, renewable cost reduction case, higher nuclear contribution, higher cost reduction of hydrogen, CCUS, and demand transportation. We made a various scenario study to indicate the implication of the cost rise in electricity. And very importantly, the current marginal cost of electricity supply to Japan is currently calculated at 13 yen per kilowatt hour. But in any scenario, the marginal electricity cost for Japan increased almost double. In case of reference case scenario, it is around 25 yen per kilowatt hour. And when we calculated that the RE 100%, the marginal electricity cost is almost 53 yen per kilowatt. It is extremely high. So RE 100% option, if we assume we need to bond at the very, very high cost of electricity. But in any case, if we really want to meet the carbon neutrality status, the electricity cost run-up is inevitable. And change it for RN and EE and ES is enormous. For RE, for Japan still, that RE cost is expensive. And economic burden for Japanese citizens and industry is very considerable. And because of the land limitation or site limitation, the availability of appropriate site or a suitable site is a very serious concern for Japan. And of course, Japan's natural condition or weather condition in terms of the sunshine, in terms of the wind, we are unfortunately not as good as some country in Europe or some country in the United States, some country in the Middle East. I do believe that this is very similar to some of the ASEAN countries, including yourselves. And also, when the share of renewable wind and solar increase, the intermittency issue is very important, and it directly increases the integrated cost. And furthermore, we need to pay attention to the inertia force issues. Again, to address this inertia force, we can do it technically, but again, it will create a cost. EE and ES, the bottom line is low-hanging fruit for energy saving are gone for Japan because Japan is a top runner. And current EE target in 2018 SEP met only 30%. But now, as I mentioned, the EE target further enhanced. So still, there's a much more to do. And in terms of the nuclear challenge, put it very simply, if we really meet the 2030 new target, we will need 27 nuclear power plants in operation in normal circumstances. But the problem is that we have only 10 nuclear power plants at this moment to be restarted. Another 17 nuclear power plants need to be restarted to meet this target. But given the social sensitivity or difficulty surrounding for the nuclear, it is still unknown at what pace and what level we can see that the actual nuclear power restart. And more importantly, if we really meet the 2050 target, we need to enhance not only the restart itself, but also we have go ahead or green light for the lifetime extension from the 40 years to 60 years. And also we need to have some contribution from new nuclear power plant to be constructed and to be in operation in the year 2050. It's a long way to go. And next slide, please. And as for the challenge for hydrogen, ammonia, and the fossil fuel, this is again very difficult and important. Firstly, hydrogen, ammonia, but we need to establish both international and domestic supply chain to meet the growing need of hydrogen, ammonia, and to meet, in particular, to establish the international supply chain. We need to have an international cooperation with stakeholders in the world, like stakeholders in the Middle East, Russia, United States, and of course, potentially with Malaysia. And furthermore, the cost reduction will be the key. The hydrogen cost is expected to be very, very expensive, but we need to be very, very aggressive to reduce cost. And one option or one approach to address this issue is the use of CO2-free ammonia, which can utilize the existing infrastructure and existing facility. That's why many people are paying a great attention to CO2-free ammonia. Then the promotion of the use of the hydrogen and ammonia itself is important. It should be used firstly probably in the power sector, but also it should be used in the transportation sector and industry sector and other sectors. And fossil fuel, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, to address the market volatility and security of supply is important. And more internationally, we are seeing the very strong headwind, in particular for coal. This should be addressed properly. Otherwise, it is very difficult for Japan or for any country to continue to rely on the fossil fuel. And last slide, please. I'll be very in short. In conclusion, we continue to face the 3E+S challenges, and we are happy to be in the final stage of SEP to be revised and finally cabinet approved. And in this revised SEP, we need to address the very, very ambitious target of 2050 carbon neutral and 2030 46 GHG reduction target. The both target is very, very ambitious, but from a different angle. 2030 target is a kind of a fight against the time because we have only 9 years left. 2050, it's very, very unknown and uncharted water voyage, but we need to overcome the difficulty and challenge with a very enhanced effort by government and industry and Japanese citizens. But clearly, innovation will be the key. And international cooperation need to play a key role to achieve 3E process and also to promote the use of innovation. I'll stop here. Thank you very much indeed. And I apologize the inconvenience caused by the interruption.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ken, for a very insightful and informative presentation. And now we are in a discussion session. Now let's discuss what we can learn from Japan's experience toward carbon neutrality under the impact of COVID-19. In the meantime, let me remind everybody that you can post your question in the Q&A panel. Okay, Prof, I think let's dive into the conversation related to the topic. I'll start with a broader question, Prof. I think as you presented, we can see that the Strategic Energy Plan, or SEP, incorporate the policies that represent comprehensive and systematic changes in Japan. Can you share with us further the underlying process of preparing the SEP? You mentioned, like, for example, just now, the IEA net zero emission report is based on backcasting. So what are the differences in terms of assumption that IEJ used from the last SEP in 2018 to the current SEP?
Thank you, Dr. Sidi, for your great question. There are many important differences or changes from the SEP in 2018 to the current SEP. But probably most fundamental difference or change is ambitiousness, the degree of ambitiousness in terms of GHG reduction target. The previous SEP, we pursued the 26% reduction in the year 2030 and around 80% GHG reduction in the year 2050. But now we are aiming at carbon neutrality status in the year 2050, together with 46%. The increased ambitiousness gives great differences in terms of the challenge that we need to overcome. And second important characteristic of the difference between the two is a difference in the approach. Traditionally, Japan employed a bottom-up approach. In other words, the METI Advisory Council continues the discussion gathered by experts and industry executives and academia to come up with a conclusion and make a recommendation to METI minister, and the METI minister put it on the cabinet table to be discussed and agreed. But this time, as I mentioned earlier, the first point is Prime Minister's declaration of carbon neutrality and Prime Minister's declaration of 46% reduction. This can become a very important given condition. That's why we call it the top-down approach. After this very important condition is given, the advisory committee needed to find out a solution to meet this top-down condition. So the traditional approach and the new approach is completely different. And the third point is the role of innovation. And of course, it's related to the level of ambitiousness. But if we really want to achieve the carbon neutrality in the years to come to up to 2050, the existing technology and existing infrastructure, existing options need to play a big role, but it's not enough. Innovation must be there. That's why we make a good expectation, but it's creates a lot of uncertainty. I hope that this gives an answer to your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Ken. I think it is interesting that the innovation is the key there. I think to ask a follow-up question on that, Prof, I would like to ask you then, I think the SCP, I think we can see that trying to figure out the energy pathways in Japan with all the complexity that we have seen over the last year with the COVID-19 crisis and all the economic and political turmoil around the world. In your presentation, you mentioned the medium and long term of energy planning in Japan, and how would this medium and long-term policies influence the decarbonization effort in response to the global COVID-19 pandemic? If you can just respond on this.
Okay. Dr. Siti, again, thank you very much for your very important question. Your last word is decarbonization effort in the post-pandemic.
Yes, in the post-pandemic, yes.
Yeah. The keyword, the post-pandemic, means that every country, Japan also, but probably the Malaysia as well, the government needed to prioritize the protection of safety of citizens or nations.
Yeah.
The pandemic created a very difficult, politically and socially difficult situation in the world and in every country. The protection of citizens' health and safety is becoming a very important priority. And also, every country faces a very serious economic condition because of the pandemic. So post-corona economic recovery need to be incorporated in the energy and environmental policy as well. That's why Japanese government as well, but the European government and the Biden administration all aims to use the carbon neutrality investment can be utilized both in terms of long-term growth strategy, but also the post-corona economic recovery. And after the pandemic evolved, I also mentioned that we are seeing the very difficult international politics and international geopolitics. In particular, the most important case is the US-China very difficult bilateral relationship. So under the circumstances, all the energy policy and the climate policy and decarbonized policy need to consider the priority of protection of citizens and the post-corona recovery and pay attention to the international high difficult geopolitics. And this is a very important element for the SEP consideration for Japan and potentially for Malaysia as well. I'll stop here.
Oh, thank you very much, Prof. Ken, for the explanation with regards to your SCP. I think our next question is, I think the Paris Agreement and the commitment of the country and the private sector to reduce carbon emissions and net zero emission by 2050 are essential steps. Still, I believe, as you have highlighted, these are only the beginning of our voyage into uncharted waters toward carbon neutrality. So in your opinion, Prof, so what does it take in terms of resources, policy or regulation that you can see to transform the energy systems?
Okay, I'll be happy to answer your question, Dr. Sidi. And again, this is a very great question. And put it simply, if the needed change is a kind of evolution, or in other words, the change, gradual change over time, I think that the need to employ various options and resources can be limited. But as I mentioned, carbon neutrality requires revolutionary change from the current system. That's why the carbon neutrality policy requires all-out work. All available options, resources, policies are needed if we really meet the carbon neutrality status. For example, if we are talking about the government are required to develop a very serious strategy, and also not only strategy, but the roadmap to go to the carbon neutral pathway. And to actual policy implementation, the government need to create a sufficient market design, and also government need to play a key role to promote R&D. As I mentioned, if we really want to the carbon neutrality, the innovation is a must. That's why R&D policy will be, again, the very key. What about industry? The industry needed to develop its own business strategy to survive in the carbon neutral world. Every companies and industry are now seeing that changing its business environment. the financial market is changing. And under the circumstances that the the companies and the industry need to develop its own survival business strategy, and also to make the necessary investment to accommodate the change towards the carbon neutrality. In society, the most important issue is behavioral changes in terms of energy saving, in terms of using a more cleaner energy system, that the behavioral changes must. But not only behavioral change, in my view, I think that the society needed to understand that the carbon neutrality world is a higher cost one. I explained earlier in my case for Japan, the energy cost, electricity cost can be higher as compared to the current system. But if we really want to protect the environment, it is a kind of a must. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your explanation. I think, but based on what you have said, it sounds to me that there is a very distinct element in transforming the energy systems. I think not only setting the direction in the long term, but also putting cohesive policies considering all levels, industries, government, and the people, and the correct technology and the correct research and development for reducing the carbon emissions. Okay, taking from what you mentioned, Prof, the net zero emission by 2050 thing could not be, I think you mentioned that to achieve without continuous support and participation from the people and citizens, as you said, particularly behavior changes towards this energy efficiency and renewable energy is very important. In this perspective, can you enlighten us on Japan's most significant energy transformation challenge towards carbon neutrality with regards to having a responsible attitude contributes toward a sustainable future?
Okay, thank you very much again for your question. Probably my answer to this question has some kind of overlap to my previous answer or explanation, but I think it's important, so I may repeat some of the point. Yes, I agree that if we really want to have the net zero emission status by 2050, continuous support and participation from the people, citizens must. And again, carbon neutrality status is a kind of a great challenge to a kind of a completely different world or different system from the ongoing or existing system. We can draw a map by calculation, for example, to increase the share of renewable from the current, say, 20% to 60% or 70% or 80%. We can draw a map.
Yep.
But drawing a map and implementation and realization is a great difference. Implementation gap exists in the real world. Or in other words, in the years to come, if we pursue the carbon neutral pathway, it is a fight against uncertainties. It is a fight against unknowns. It is a fight against unpredictability. We need to go on despite these uncertainty, unknowns, unpredictability, if we really want to change our system to carbon neutral system, because all the existing infrastructure or supply chain should be replaced to the one which can fit to the carbon neutral infrastructure, carbon neutral supply chain. And again, I think that once again, that innovation must be realized. We should enhance energy efficiency. We should enhance the use of renewable and nuclear power, if applicable. And we should enhance the electrification with zero emission power. But we cannot reach carbon neutral, just energy efficiency, renewable, and nuclear power, and electrification. we need to have the contribution of innovation such as hydrogen, ammonia, and direct air capture, whatever. And higher cost is inevitable, as I mentioned, but higher cost should be borne or should be shouldered by society and consumer. That is a very important message to be understood for the nation. Cleaner energy system and cleaner environment is fine for everybody. It is important for every country, but I do believe if we really head for that system, probably the cost is higher. That's a key message. I think that it should be understood properly. Of course, cost run-up should be minimized. It is an effort made by government and industry, but there will be a kind of no free lunch. I'll stop here.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that is a very important point with regards to achieving this carbon emission and also carbon neutral. But I think I want to move to the next question, Prof. I think digital technologies, as you mentioned, innovation, right, can act as the drivers of sustainability and can become an opportunity for reducing emission and environmental policy. It seems that access to digital infrastructure will become an essential requirement for doing business, I think, in the face of a pandemic. So I just would like to inquire, how does Japanese government cultivate digital infrastructures when pursuing the 2050 carbon neutrality?
Okay, Dr. Sidi, thank you very much. Yes, it's a very important question that you asked me. And for the current Japanese government headed by Prime Minister Suga, one of the key words for the reviving Japanese economy is to try to address climate change with a clean energy investment, but at the same time, DX, digital transformation or digital revolution, is again the very, very key important issue. And the commonality or the common challenge is again the technology innovation. And if Japan or any country can get supremacy status in terms of the technology competition in the world, it will give us a great opportunity to have the longer term economic prosperity or longer term economic growth. And that's why we should combine the effort of DX or digital transformation together with carbon neutrality energy transformation. And again, as you pointed out, the experience of the post-COVID-19 pandemic gives us a great lesson that we can reduce or reconstruct the energy system with the appropriate use of digital technology. That's why we are now conducting webinar with this technology. Beforehand, I have to be in Kuala Lumpur or we have to be Putrajaya to make a presentation, but now we can do it with the best use of technology. And with these technologies, I think that any country or company can be better off. But again, how to win this very serious technology competition is again the very important challenge for any government in the world. Okay?
Yeah, okay, Prof. Thank you for the point. I think this will be the final question to you, Prof, for this moderation session.
Okay.
As reported in the Biennial Update Report 3, Malaysia had achieved carbon neutrality in 2004, where we managed a balance between emitting carbon and also absorbing the carbon emission from carbon sinks. The net carbon was positive after that, and in the last reporting, the net carbon was positive at 35.46 million tons in 2016. Based on these facts and considering the COVID-19 crisis that we are facing now, it is clear that strategic measures are needed to address the environmental challenges and resilience of the societies in responding to potential climate-related disasters. So what is your recommendation, Prof, for Malaysia considering the global climate and economic uncertainties in moving towards carbon neutrality?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Siti, for this question, which is last one for this moderated session. Yes, I totally agree that Malaysia is making its own very serious effort to address climate change and carbon neutrality status. And I think Malaysia as a country is encouraged to pursue this carbon neutrality status in the long run. But at the same time, we should pay attention to that it's a country-specific condition in terms of energy, of course, but in terms of economy, in terms of the social development, in terms of resource endowment, everything. Every country has its own specific conditions. No one country is completely similar. Of course, EU, Japan, United States is now heading for carbon neutral status in the year 2050, but probably it depends on countries, including Malaysia, at what time, at what condition, and at what speed you will try to enhance the effort to head for carbon neutral status. I think would need to be further enhanced. But at the same time, I do believe it is great and greatly reasonable to enhance your effort based on your own specific condition and to take the realistic and programmatic approach. And I would like to point out that in this regard, we had a very interesting and very important meeting gathered by energy ministers of Japan and ASEAN countries, including Malaysia. This energy ministers dialogue happened at May this year, and at the gathering, that Asia Energy Transition Initiative was published. Based on the agreement of the ministers. The key point is ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, are all encouraged to pursue carbon neutrality, but based on the very pragmatic and realistic approach. And to this pathway, depending on the country's circumstance, Japan will be very happy to support the roadmap building to create carbon neutrality status in some days, not specifically in 2050, 2060, 2070, or 2080, whatever timing. And Japan will be happy to work together with the respective ASEAN government. And actually, if my understanding is correct, now the government is working very closely with the government of Thailand. And I think the key point is again, the pragmatism and the realism, and also ambitiousness, the balance between ambition and pragmatics and realistic can be a very important element. So I think that, that Malaysia is no doubt to go on the more clean energy system, potentially to head for carbon neutral based on your condition. That's my key point.
Well, thank you very much for the sharing, the key points and also recommendation, Prof. Ken. So we will have to stop it here to allow for a Q&A from the participants. So now I think we are in the Q&A session. We have received many questions over the, I think, almost 1 hour discussion. So I think we have about, 20 minutes for the Q&A session, and we will try to address all inquiries to Prof. Ken Koyama within the time frame. Prof. Ken, I think there is a many question here. I think I would like to read the question from the participants to you. The first question that we have here, what are your views on blue hydrogen? Will blue hydrogen have a legitimate role in the energy transition? Prof?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a good question, I think. And in particular, as a country, Japan is trying to play a very key role to establish blue hydrogen international supply chain. Hydrogen's benefit is enormous. It's completely ultimate clean energy sources, and CO2-free hydrogen can be produced by various approach, including from the renewable energy electrolysis. It's a green hydrogen. Blue hydrogen comes from the use of fossil fuel with the use of CCS or CCUS technology. And hydrogen, CO2 hydrogen also can be produced from the use of nuclear power. We call it yellow hydrogen. And I think that every possible CO2 hydrogen should play a role depending on the circumstance of a specific country condition, as I mentioned earlier, in case of Malaysia. And in case of Japan, we had some idea to produce green hydrogen by using that our own domestic renewable energy, but renewable energy cost, power generation cost in Japan is expensive. So that's why we are thinking that for Japan, that the blue hydrogen is more likely candidate to contribute to Japan's carbon neutral status. That's why we are working very closely with Middle East countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others. And we are trying to work with Russia. We are trying to work with Australia, Canada, and potentially, I do believe that we can work together with Malaysia as well, because that Malaysia has plenty and enormous natural gas resources now, which is used for domestic gas supply as well as LNG export to the world. But as the use of fossil fuel can be increasingly difficult in the years to come, in the longer term, the use of fossil fuel to be transformed into the CO2-free energy source, such as blue hydrogen, can be a potentially important strategic tool for Malaysia as a cooperation with a consuming country like Japan. So Japan and IEJ and I myself will try to work very hard to promote the concept of blue hydrogen and blue ammonia in particular. The blue ammonia is also a very, very useful tool to reduce cost of supply to consumer.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Second question that we have here, I think this is from Encik Rosman of MGA. So he would like to ask you, can you enlighten us what are the difference between carbon neutral and net zero emission, Prof?
Actually, I would say it can be the same. Carbon neutral means that neutral is actually net zero. There are some element of emissions from the system, like the remaining the use of fossil fuel, like as I show you in my slide. Even though we made a very strict, very serious effort, in the year 2050, we need to use that CO2. We need to use that fossil fuel in case, for example, that the petrochemical in oil. And from this fossil fuel use, we will have an actual CO2 emission. But this emitted CO2 emission volume should be net zero by the use of technology such as the DAX or BECS. And with this, we can reach the status of net zero emission status. So I would say that net zero emission and carbon neutrality can be used in parallel.
Okay, noted, Prof, on that. So the third question that we have here, I think we have many, but I think we try to address this question as much as possible. The third question is, this is from Professor Zulkifli of EMOC. What is your advice to Malaysian government on having a nuclear energy as part of future energy mix in Malaysia, Prof? So this is the question.
Thank you very much. The choice of energy source or energy option completely depend on the country's strategic thinking. And in case of Japan, with very limited fossil fuel resources inside, and with a very severe experience of 1970 oil crisis, we strategically decided to develop a nuclear power as a kind of a very important tool to address energy security. And after that, the climate change, because the nuclear power emits no CO2 at the time of the power generation. Again, it depends on Japan's specific condition. And clearly, the nuclear power has its own advantage. Very stable and reliable power supply, and also potentially the very cost competitive and base load power supply with CO2 zero. But as the Fukushima nuclear accident completely realized Japanese citizens, we need to understand the risk itself. So I say that the Malaysian government need to consider from the strategic viewpoint, what will be the future of Malaysian energy supply demand structure. Of course, everybody knows Malaysia used to boast the very important domestic oil and gas resources, but in the long run, you may become import-dependent nation when your domestic oil and gas resources gradually is lower. And at that point, how to address the climate change, energy security with the increasing import dependence, you may consider the choice of nuclear power. But at the same time, nuclear power is a very, very complicated energy and electricity system with great technology and experience. So probably you may very seriously consider the international cooperation with a nuclear technology country, Japan, the United States, or France, or now China is emerging as a very nuclear technology country, or Russia. So I do believe that there's a good chance and a good opportunity to consider that the nuclear option for Malaysia in the long run. But again, it depends on the country's specific strategic consideration.
Okay, noted, Prof. Okay, I think the next question that we have here, I think you mentioned about the SEP process just now, Prof. I think there is a question from our participant would like to actually ask you, how much would the public feedback have an impact on the SEP process? And will the SEP be revised if the public feels that fossil fuels and nuclear should never be in the new SEP, for instance? So
okay,
can you respond on that?
Thank you very much. Yes, during the course of the discussion of SEP, Advisory Council gathered the various opinion from the people, and of course that Advisory Council member itself tried to represent the various voice of Japanese society. I said that the members are including those from academia, those from mass media, those from industry, both energy industry and non-energy industry, large-scale company and small-scale company, and research think tank and professionals. So the combination of various members is try to reflect the various voice and opinion of Japanese society. But at the same time, the secretariat of the advisory council tries to incorporate that the various people's opinion. And also, when the draft is finally made, the draft is available for public opinion. So there are numbers, probably more than 1,000 of public opinion is gathered, and based on the public opinion, and the final draft is really authorized to submit to the ministers. And once the SEP is approved by government and can become an official document, I understand that still many people has a different opinion on the energy option. As I mentioned, if the government says we need to have a contribution for nuclear power of 20 to 20%, some people said, no, I don't like nuclear power. But some people, I think that the nuclear power, the ratio should be reduced, or we should eliminate the contribution of nuclear power. There are a wide variety of opinion inside Japan. But I think once the government sets a strategy, at least the government policy and industries and investment is head for this the set government target. And of course, Japan is a free country to address his or her opinion. If he said we have more nuclear or we should zero nuclear, there's no penalty. It's our society is free to say anything, even if we don't like our prime minister and openly said there's no problem. So that's a badge of kind of free world.
All right. Okay, right, Prof. So I think the next question that we have here, I think the participant from Ministry of Energy, I think he would like to know whether, because in your presentation there is two questions here from the participant. The Japan's energy mix covers the whole energy spectrum or only electricity? So that is the first one. And the second one, under the Japan's energy mix, hydrogen appear as a fuel of choice. Does COVID-19 pandemic somehow influence the decision to push for this hydrogen use in Japan?
Okay, thank you very much for this very important question. Two questions. The first one, yes, today I explained the power mix as a kind of symbolic big difference. But of course, if we try to reduce the GHG by 46% in total, we need to take into account not only power mix, but overall total primary energy mix. So the answer is not only power, but also comprehensively overall energy supply demand mix is required to count for that 46% as well as carbon neutrality status. The second question about hydrogen with the possible impact of the COVID-19, I do believe in reality there is not a big difference made by the COVID-19. The only possible difference made by the impact of COVID-19 has some relation with geopolitics. As I mentioned, that after the corona world, I think that Japan needs to pay attention to the very difficult international politics or geopolitics. In particular, many people in Japan, politicians, the government officials, the industry people, myself, pay great attention to the very difficult US-China relation. Why? For Japan, United States is a very important ally. For China, we have very important economic partner. So the difficult relation between US and China creates a very sensitive and very difficult consideration, strategic consideration on the geopolitics. And of course, as an ally, we need to cooperate with the United States. And US and China is now working very hard to make which is the winner of the advanced technology in the field of information technology or other energy-related technology.
Right.
So that's why Japan needs to become a top runner of advanced technology. And if we can be successfully top runner of high technology or advanced technology, innovative technology like hydrogen, this can become the very good tools, strategic tool for Japan to survive in this difficult global environment. So I think that under the circumstance, Japan is now really want to become the top runner for the hydrogen, and we are working very hard on that. But
Right.
Frankly speaking, the carbon neutrality is more influential tool or driver to promote the use of hydrogen. But because you asked the question about the possible impact of corona, post-corona, COVID-19, I made this answer to you.
Okay, right. Thank you, Prof, for that. But I think perhaps I can relate this question to the question from another participant.
Okay.
So he would like to know whether in your the energy mix projection in the long term by 2050 that you presented, does that projection includes battery storage to attend to the intermittent generation from the solar energy?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
As you may remember, that the difference case analysis, we put the number of over 50% renewable power generation in total power system in Japan. Probably mostly come from solar PV and wind power, and probably major offshore wind power is a great contribution to this over 50% renewable contribution. In that regard, I think that the intermittency issue is very serious, and probably we need to set up the large-scale battery system together with a large-scale investment in the power grid. And also, I do believe some part of the storage system is not only from the electric battery, but also a hydrogen battery. Because if we depend in large scale of intermittent renewable, in some cases, in some period, that low power generation period, it can be expected that the electric battery system is good to meet the very short-term intermittency, but the long-term intermittency or weeks or even months, I think that the hydrogen battery, a hydrogen storage system need to play a role. That's why when 100% renewable electricity marginal cost is extremely high, this reflects the integration cost, including the battery and other system to accommodate the intermittency.
Okay, right. So that's, yeah. So I think that is, yeah, we can see that from the RE 100% scenario. Okay, I think this would be the final question to you, Prof. I think this is the last question that I think we can have in this session. It is interesting to note that the high CCUS provide the lowest electricity cost in the various scenarios simulated in your SCP. So can this trend be generalized across the ASEAN energy landscape?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting possibility. I would like to emphasize that the word possibility.
Okay.
If you can find the appropriate and economically competitive and technologically reliable CCUS option, I think that this will lead to a good chance to limit the increase of electricity cost. But again, please note, even though we can possibly limit the increase in cost, the increase itself can be inevitable.
Okay.
As I mentioned, the current price electricity cost of Japan is 13 yen. And in any cases, we expect that the electricity marginal supply cost will exceed 20 yen. 24, 25, 22, 23. It differs a little bit, but the point is we need to pay extra cost if we really head for the carbon neutrality. And in this regard, we need to pursue various options, including CCUS, renewable, and hydrogen, and nuclear power. And if we can successfully reduce cost in specific technology like hydrogen or CCUS or nuclear power, we should pay much more priority on this aspect. That's why we made an all-out war for all-out options.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. I think that's the wrap for the Q&A session. I think we come to the end of the session. I think we had many questions, but due to the time, we are not able to answer all the questions right now. But you can always reach out to IPRI and Prof. Ken Koyama through our website or our email. You can also download the slide from the Q&A control panel, or you can also download later in our IPRI website. But I think before we end, the key takeaway that we learned from today's webinar is that, as we can see, the COVID-19 pandemic and future uncertainties will have a dramatic impact on the energy supply and demand in the short term, and will have a lasting implication in post-pandemic. I think the medium and the long-term energy transition measures at the national level and consistent, cohesive policies and commitment are essential to achieve the energy transition and turn the carbon neutrality expectation shared across government, industries, and people into concrete action. When pursuing carbon neutrality, in addition to realizing such an energy supply and demand structure, innovative technologies and digital infrastructures are also required to be reinforced. We learned that carbon neutrality would require an enormous effort at all levels, and it will not be something that will happen overnight. And strategic energy transition policies will inspire people to act, and businesses and other stakeholders to make sensible investment decisions for a sustainable future. I think we learned from today's webinar that the key to reaching the Paris goals remain policy, the political choices, and policy delivered around the globe that encourages the correct behavioral changes and enable the right technology solution to scale. So with that, we come to the end of the session. I would like to thank Prof. Ken. Prof. Ken, thank you very much for the time and a very engaging session that we have today. To all participants, before you leave us, please remember to complete the feedback form using the link and the Q&A control panel after the webinar. Your feedback is very important to us. I would like to also record apologies for the technical glitch that we have in early part of our webinars. And once again, thank you very much for participating in this webinar. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.